From the very first pages of Scripture, the Bible insists that history is not accidental. Nations do not simply appear, expand, and collide by chance. Behind every people and every power stands a boundary God already knew, long before maps were drawn or names were given. Centuries before Islam rose from the deserts of Arabia, the Bible had already spoken of a people born outside the central covenant, yet never outside God's control. A people destined to live in constant tension with their brothers. This was not written after the fact. It was recorded before Islam existed. If that is true, then Islam is not just a historical phenomenon. It is a biblical question. Like the video, leave a comment, subscribe, and keep watching. Because what Scripture reveals next changes how history itself is understood. From the opening pages of Scripture, the Bible makes one thing unmistakably clear. History does not drift. Nations do not rise by coincidence, and entire civilizations do not appear without being anticipated somewhere within the boundaries of God's revealed plan. What later generations called geopolitics, Scripture frames as consequence. What historians describe as momentum, the Bible treats as permission. Islam, therefore, cannot be approached merely as a religious movement that emerged in 7th century Arabia, nor as a political force that expanded through conquest and consolidation. To read it that way is to begin far too late. The biblical narrative pushes the reader backward, past empires and borders, past Mecca and Medina, past Muhammad himself, until the story reaches a much older crossroads, one hidden within the household of Abraham. Long before Islam had a name, Scripture introduced a tension that never truly resolved. Two sons were born under the same roof, both carrying promises, yet only one carrying the covenant. One was born through human calculation, the other through divine intervention. One was blessed to become a great nation, the other chosen to carry the redemptive line through which the Messiah would come. The Bible does not rush past this moment, and it does not treat it as a footnote. It lingers, because everything that follows grows out of it. When Sarah urged Abraham to act rather than wait, she did not imagine she was shaping the future of nations. She believed she was solving a private problem. Scripture, however, records the decision with unsettling precision, because God would not erase the outcome of human impatience, even while refusing to place it at the center of his covenant. Ishmael was not rejected, but he was not enthroned. He was promised growth, protection, and a future, but not inheritance. That distinction matters because it explains why Islam exists at all within a biblical framework. The Bible does not present Ishmael's destiny as accidental, nor does it portray his descendants as outside God's awareness. Instead, it describes a people who would live in the presence of all their brothers, marked by proximity, tension, and unresolved rivalry. The text does not soften this reality, nor does it rush to reconcile it. What is striking is not that Islam later emerged from regions associated with Ishmael's descendants, but that Scripture already accounted for a powerful people arising outside the covenant line, shaped by blessing, yet separated from promise. The Bible never treats this as a failure of God's plan. It treats it as part of it. The question, then, is not whether Islam is influential, expansive, or enduring. History has already answered that. The deeper question is why Scripture spoke of such a destiny long before Islam entered the world, and what that foresight reveals about how God governs nations, tests faith, and unfolds history toward an end he has already declared. The story does not begin with conflict between nations. It begins with a promise that seemed impossible to fulfill, and with a waiting period that tested human trust. God had spoken clearly to Abraham, declaring that his descendants would become as numerous as the dust of the earth. Yet year after year passed with no child, no visible sign, and no clarification of timing. Scripture does not hide the strain this delay placed on Abraham and Sarah, nor does it soften the silence that stretched across decades. Sarah's barrenness was not merely a personal sorrow. In the biblical world, it was a crisis of legacy, identity, and future. As the years slipped by, the promise of God appeared increasingly abstract, vulnerable to doubt and reinterpretation. It was in this space where faith and impatience collided that a decision was made. Sarah offered Hagar, her Egyptian servant, to Abraham, not as rebellion, but as a solution. The plan did not deny God's promise. It attempted to fulfill it by human means. Ishmael was born from that decision, and Scripture is careful with its language. He was Abraham's son, fully and unmistakably, yet his birth is described as occurring according to the flesh. This phrase is not an insult, nor is it incidental. It marks a distinction between what humans can produce through effort and what God alone brings into being through promise. For 13 years, Ishmael was Abraham's only son, the visible proof that something had been accomplished, even if the promise itself remained unresolved. When Isaac was later born through Sarah, by divine intervention rather than human planning, the household became a living illustration of two paths unfolding side by side. The tension between the sons was not merely emotional. It was theological. One represented human initiative attempting to assist God, while the other embodied trust that waited until human ability was exhausted. Scripture records their conflict not to dramatize family strife, but to preserve the meaning of the moment. God's response to this tension is revealing. He does not erase Ishmael, nor does he revoke the blessing spoken over him. Instead, he draws a boundary. The covenant, the line through which redemption would flow, would pass through Isaac, not Ishmael. At the same time, God promises to make Ishmael into a great nation, explicitly grounding that promise in the fact that he is Abraham's offspring. Blessing is affirmed, inheritance is denied, and the separation is made permanent. This is the foundation upon which later history rests. Islam does not trace back to rebellion against God, but to a blessing that was never meant to carry the covenant itself. The distinction established in Genesis explains why power, growth, and endurance can exist alongside spiritual separation, without contradicting the sovereignty of God. Stay with us and continue watching, because the consequences of this decision do not fade with time. They expand, multiply, and shape the course of nations far beyond Abraham's tent. Scripture does something unexpected when it turns to Ishmael. Instead of moving quickly past him to focus on Isaac, it pauses. Names are listed, borders are described, locations are marked. Genesis records the descendants of Ishmael with deliberate care, as if to ensure that his line would never be dismissed as incidental or forgotten. The Bible names 12 sons, 12 princes, echoing language used elsewhere for peoples destined to carry influence and structure rather than obscurity. This matters because the biblical text does not speak vaguely about Ishmael's future. It anchors his descendants in real geography, stretching from Havilah to Shur, a region corresponding broadly to the Arabian landscape. The language is restrained, factual, and precise. Ishmael's people are not described as wandering aimlessly across history, but as dwelling, settling, and existing in constant proximity to their brothers. The phrase, "in the presence of all his brothers," signals more than location. It implies enduring nearness, unresolved tension, and an inescapable shared horizon. Later attempts to either exaggerate or dismiss this lineage often miss the Bible's intent. Scripture does not claim that every Arab people in history descends exclusively from Ishmael, nor does it reduce complex ethnic realities to a single bloodline. Instead, it establishes a pattern. Ishmael represents a line blessed for expansion, survival, and visibility, yet positioned outside the covenant through which redemption would come. His destiny is collective, geopolitical, and historical rather than messianic. What follows across the centuries aligns with this framework. Names associated with Ishmael's sons appear in ancient Assyrian inscriptions, confirming that these tribes were known, recognized, and engaged in regional power structures long before Islam emerged. Scripture does not require exhaustive archaeological proof to validate its claim, because its focus is not on cataloging ethnicity, but on identifying trajectory. Ishmael's line would endure. It would grow. It would not disappear into the margins. Crucially, the Bible never portrays this endurance as a threat to God's promise, nor as a failure of divine foresight. Ishmael's destiny unfolds exactly as spoken, neither exceeding nor falling short of what God declared. He becomes the father of peoples who matter, who shape history, and who remain visible long after many other ancient lines vanish. This framing is essential because it prevents a simplistic reading of later developments. When Islam eventually arises within regions associated with Ishmael's descendants, it does not emerge from a vacuum of meaning. It steps into a space Scripture had already outlined. A powerful people, blessed yet separate, present yet unresolved, moving through history alongside the covenant line, rather than within it. For centuries after Genesis, the biblical narrative falls silent on Ishmael's descendants, not because they vanish, but because Scripture is tracing something slower than events. While Israel receives the law, builds the temple, and preserves the prophetic line, the children of Ishmael multiply beyond the borders of the covenant, shaped by desert survival, trade routes, and tribal loyalties rather than written revelation. Their story develops in the margins of Scripture, yet never outside its awareness. By the time history approaches late antiquity, the Arabian Peninsula is no longer an empty wilderness. Caravan networks cross its interior, linking the Mediterranean world with Africa and Asia. Tribes move, settle, fracture, and realign. Some remain nomadic, others establish centers of commerce. Mecca emerges as one of those centers, sustained by trade and by religion, long before Islam appears. It is already a place people travel toward, a place where belief and economy intersect. The Kaaba stands at the heart of this system, functioning as a sanctuary that gathers devotion from across the peninsula. Tradition describes it as housing numerous idols, reflecting a fragmented spiritual landscape where many gods coexist without resolving the deeper question of truth. Whether the number of idols is symbolic or literal, the picture Scripture allows us to see is one of religious diffusion rather than clarity. Monotheistic memory exists, but it is diluted, surrounded by ritual, custom, and inherited practice. This environment matters because Islam does not arise among a people ignorant of God. It emerges among descendants of Abraham who have retained fragments of monotheism while lacking covenant direction. The desert does not erase the promise spoken over Ishmael. It preserves it in another form, waiting for a unifying force strong enough to gather scattered tribes into a single identity. Nothing here contradicts the biblical pattern. God often allows long seasons of preparation before sudden convergence. Silence does not mean absence. Delay does not mean abandonment. By the time the 7th century arrives, the stage is already set. A people blessed for growth, shaped by hardship, unified by ancestry, and surrounded by religious confusion. What follows will not create that identity. It will crystallize it. If this framework is already challenging assumptions, like the video, leave a comment, subscribe to the channel, and keep watching, because what emerges next transforms desert tribes into a global force. When Islam enters history in the 7th century, it does so not as an interruption, but as a convergence. The Arabian world into which Muhammad is born is already prepared for unification, even if it does not yet recognize the shape that unification will take. Tribal divisions remain strong, yet shared ancestry, language, and geography bind the people together beneath the surface. What is missing is not identity, but direction. Muhammad is born into the Quraysh tribe of Mecca, a clan already entrusted with religious and commercial authority. Orphaned early, he grows up moving within caravan culture, exposed to diverse beliefs and practices. Over time, he gains a reputation for integrity that grants him trust beyond tribal boundaries. This social credibility becomes crucial when his message begins to challenge the religious foundations of Mecca itself. The proclamation Muhammad brings is stark and uncompromising. There is one God, and all idols must fall. In a society built around inherited religious practice and economic dependence on pilgrimage, this message threatens far more than theology. It disrupts order. Resistance follows quickly, and persecution forces Muhammad and his followers to leave Mecca, marking a decisive break between old structures and emerging authority. The migration to Yathrib, later known as Medina, becomes the turning point. There, Islam shifts from a persecuted message to an organizing power. Agreements are formed, disputes are arbitrated, and a new framework of loyalty emerges that transcends bloodline while still binding tribes together. This framework is often described as a charter or constitution, though historically it functions more accurately as an intertribal covenant rather than the first formal constitution in human history. What matters biblically is not the label, but the result. Scattered tribes become a single community, defined by submission to one God. Loyalty is redirected. Identity is reshaped. Within a single generation, the descendants of Ishmael are unified under a religious system that gives them law, discipline, and purpose. When Muhammad later returns to Mecca and removes the idols from the Kaaba, the act symbolizes more than religious reform. It marks the consolidation of a people long prepared for cohesion. 2 years after his death, that cohesion does not collapse. It accelerates. The promise spoken over Ishmael to become a great nation begins to manifest visibly, rapidly, and irreversibly. Not as an accident of history, but as the fulfillment of a trajectory set in motion millennia earlier. If Islam's emergence aligns with the biblical trajectory traced from Ishmael, the next question becomes unavoidable. Why would God allow such a powerful religious system to arise, one that affirms monotheism yet denies the central claim of the gospel? Scripture does not offer a single answer. It offers a pattern, repeated throughout history, revealing how God governs nations without surrendering his redemptive purpose. The first reason is testing. From the earliest books of the Bible, God warns that he permits alternative voices to appear, not to confuse his people, but to reveal what lies beneath their profession of faith. Israel faced this repeatedly when surrounded by nations whose gods appeared strong, visible, and successful. The test was never about ignorance. It was about allegiance. Islam, affirming one God while rejecting Jesus as the Son, presents a similar dividing line. It speaks close enough to truth to demand discernment, yet far enough away to expose whether faith rests on revelation or resemblance. The second reason is discipline. Scripture consistently shows God using foreign powers as instruments when his people drift into complacency, division, or hollow ritual. Babylon was not righteous, yet it was called God's servant for a season. In the same way, the rapid expansion of Islam confronts both Israel and the Church with loss, displacement, and humiliation. Key centers of early Christianity fall. Jerusalem itself comes under non-Jewish rule. These events are not framed biblically as proof of God's defeat, but as correction. Power is removed so that dependence might return. Comfort is shaken so that truth can be recovered. The third reason is prophetic signaling. The Bible treats nations as actors within a larger, unfolding conclusion. Islam's scale, endurance, and geographic concentration around Israel give it a role that cannot be ignored in end-time scripture. Genesis already described Ishmael's descendants as living in the presence of their brothers, and later prophets speak of surrounding nations pressing inward as history moves toward resolution. Islam's rise places a vast portion of the world into that prophetic geography, forming a visible alignment that Scripture anticipated without naming modern terms. Taken together, these reasons form a coherent biblical logic. Islam is not an interruption of God's plan, nor an endorsement of its theology. It is permitted as a test that clarifies faith, a discipline that corrects drift, and a sign that history is not wandering aimlessly. God remains sovereign over blessing and boundary alike, allowing power to rise for a time while directing all things toward an end that Scripture insists has already been written. When Jesus spoke of Jerusalem, he did not describe it as merely a city contested by politics or claimed by rival faiths. He spoke of it as a sign. His words were precise and unsettling, warning that Jerusalem would be trampled by the Gentiles until a divinely appointed season reached its completion. This statement does not invite speculation about dates. It frames history as movement toward fulfillment, measured not by calendars, but by purpose. In 638 CE, Jerusalem came under Muslim control, initiating a long period in which the city existed outside Jewish sovereignty. That period was not uninterrupted, nor was it as exaggerated as some later claims suggest. Yet its significance remains intact. For more than a millennium, with brief interruptions, the Holy City remained governed by powers that did not acknowledge the covenant promises given to Israel, nor the sonship of Christ. Scripture does not ask whether this was fair. It asks whether it was foretold. The physical landscape of Jerusalem bears this tension visibly. The Temple Mount, once the heart of Israel's worship, now holds structures sacred to Islam. The Dome of the Rock and the Al-Aqsa Mosque stand not as random monuments, but as enduring symbols of competing claims layered upon the same ground. This reality does not invalidate biblical prophecy. It intensifies it. Jerusalem becomes what the prophets described: a heavy stone, a place that draws the attention of nations and presses against the conscience of the world. What makes Jerusalem unique is not merely conflict, but concentration. Faith, history, and expectation converge there with unusual force. Islam's presence in the city is not an anomaly. It fits the biblical description of Gentile dominion lasting until its appointed limit. The city remains central precisely because it is unresolved. Control shifts, pressure builds, meaning accumulates. The Bible never treats Jerusalem's condition as permanent, nor does it portray Gentile control as the final chapter. Instead, it presents the city as a clock, marking the passage of prophetic time. As long as Jerusalem remains contested, Scripture suggests that history itself remains unfinished. This is why every development in and around the city carries disproportionate weight. Jerusalem does not merely reflect the present, it echoes the past and signals what is yet to come. Its story cannot be isolated from Islam's rise, Israel's restoration, or the Church's expectation of Christ's return. Keep watching, because what Jerusalem reveals next is not about land or power alone, but about how Scripture describes the final convergence of nations before history reaches its appointed end. The Apostle Paul returns to the story of Abraham's household, not to revisit family history, but to explain the deep structure of human religion. In his letter to the Galatians, he treats Hagar and Sarah not merely as individuals, but as representatives of two opposing ways of relating to God. One path is built on effort, obligation, and human striving. The other rests on promise, grace, and divine initiative. These paths do not converge. They compete. Hagar's son, Ishmael, is associated with what Paul calls birth according to the flesh. This does not diminish his humanity or his significance. It defines the system he represents. It is the attempt to secure blessing through obedience, discipline, and performance. Within Islam, this logic becomes fully structured. Submission, law, and religious duty shape every aspect of life, offering order and identity, yet never guaranteeing salvation. The believer strives, obeys, and hopes, but judgment remains unresolved until the end. Sarah's son Isaac stands in stark contrast. His birth occurs when human ability has reached its limit. He exists only because God intervenes. Paul links Isaac with freedom, not because discipline is absent, but because inheritance is not earned. Christianity begins where human effort ends. Salvation is presented not as a reward for achievement, but as a gift secured by Christ's completed work. Assurance flows from what has already been done, not from what might still be achieved. This contrast explains why the conflict between Ishmael and Isaac never disappears from history. It moves beyond bloodlines into belief systems. The struggle is not merely political or cultural, it is theological. One path ascends toward God through effort. The other descends from God through grace. Both claim devotion. Both demand loyalty. But only one offers rest. Scripture does not frame this tension as temporary misunderstanding. It presents it as an enduring division that will persist until history reaches its conclusion. The two systems cannot be reconciled because they answer the question of salvation in opposite ways. And as long as that question remains unresolved for humanity, the conflict that began in Abraham's tent continues to echo across the world. Biblical prophecy does not unfold to satisfy curiosity. It unfolds to expose direction. When Scripture speaks of final conflict, it does not do so to elevate fear, but to clarify allegiance. The New Testament warns that history will not conclude with neutrality, nor with multiple paths converging peacefully into truth. It speaks instead of deception refined to resemble faith, of systems that speak about God while denying His Son, and of a final separation that leaves no middle ground. The term Antichrist appears in Scripture not as a single name, but as a defining mark. The denial of Jesus Christ as the Son of God. This definition is not political, ethnic, or cultural. It is theological. Any system that removes Christ from his divine identity aligns itself against the heart of the gospel, regardless of discipline, sincerity, or moral structure. In this sense, Islam fits within a broader biblical pattern, not as the final power itself, but as part of the environment in which ultimate deception matures. The Bible also acknowledges that, even outside Scripture, echoes of the end remain. Islamic tradition speaks of Gog and Magog, of a final upheaval, of history reaching a breaking point. Yet the outcome is left unresolved. Scripture alone names the conclusion with certainty. God himself intervenes. Evil is not negotiated with. It is ended. Kingdoms rise and fall, religions expand and decline, but one reign remains untouched by time. This is why Islam's existence does not contradict the Bible. It confirms it. It stands as evidence that God allows power without covenant, influence without inheritance, and belief without redemption, for a season. That season is not endless. Scripture insists that it is moving toward closure. In the end, neither effort nor discipline secures salvation. Neither heritage nor expansion determines truth. Only the Son remains central. Every other system is measured against him and found temporary. If this study has helped clarify Scripture, like the video, leave a comment, subscribe to the channel, and thank you for watching. Stay alert, because history is moving exactly where the Bible said it would.
Come on in. It's great to have you in the study room today. Uncovering this source involves a deep dive into ancient generational and inscriptions that trace back to the household of Abraham. To me, the most striking realization is that history is a direct map, where even the descendants of Ishmael move within a trajectory spoken centuries before. We focus on documenting how a people born outside the central covenant still play a significant role as a sign for the world. At the power of Jesus, we believe that understanding this pattern is a key to recognizing God's sovereign dignities. If you value depth and substance, subscribe today. Let's keep weighing the historical evidence together.